It was a quiet Sunday evening in the summer of 1989. In a luxurious Beverly Hills mansion, where crystal chandeliers shimmered against marble walls, everything seemed wrapped in the calm opulence of American wealth. But only minutes later, that same place would turn into a crime scene that would shock the nation and leave behind more questions than answers. Jose Menendez, a powerful entertainment executive, and his wife Kitty were found lifeless in their family room, the result of a brutal and calculated attack involving a 12-gauge shotgun. Yet what stunned America wasn't just the violence, it was who the primary suspects turned out to be: their two sons, Lyle and Erik Menendez. With their polished appearances, elite education, and lives surrounded by luxury cars, Rolex watches, and private tennis coaches, Lyle and Erik once represented every parent's dream. But only weeks after their parents' deaths, the two began spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on extravagance. As reporters chased them for answers and police watched in silence, a deeply complex investigation was already underway. This wasn't simply a case of inheritance drenched in blood. This was a story of repressed memory, hidden pain, and a legal system about to be tested. Were these two young men cold-blooded killers, or were they desperate survivors of a family system that devoured them from within? What really happened inside that mansion on that August night? You're watching Echoes of the Court, where every trial reflects the human condition. And today, we step into a case that continues to haunt the American legal psyche, a case that dares us to ask, what could possibly drive two sons to cross a line from which there's no return? On the 20th of August, 1989, just past 10 p.m., a 911 call was placed from a Beverly Hills mansion on 722 North Elm Drive, Ive. On the other end of the line, a young man sobbed uncontrollably. "My parents! They're gone! They've been shot!" The caller was Lyle Menendez, 21 years old. Beside him, his 18-year-old brother Erik stood shaking, pale, nearly catatonic. When officers arrived, they were met with a scene that could only be described as cinematic horror. Jose Menendez lay back on the couch, his face unrecognizable, his chest and head ravaged by close-range shotgun blasts. Kitty, his wife, was curled up on the floor, her body riddled with wounds, including several to the face and arms. Some shots had struck her from behind. She had tried to run. The polished floor had become a canvas of violence. Yet, strangely, there were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no locks tampered with. Valuables in the home were untouched. Whoever had done this knew exactly where to go and how to leave quietly. Lyle and Erik claimed they had been out that night watching the movie Batman and stopping by a video rental store. When they returned, they said, they found the horrific scene and immediately called for help. At the time, police had no strong reason to doubt them. The brothers seemed devastated, clinging to each other, weeping. But after the funeral, time revealed inconsistencies. Within weeks of their parents' deaths, the brothers moved into a hotel in Marina del Rey, began spending lavishly Rolex watches, Porsche sports cars, private tennis lessons, even a $50,000 investment into an Italian restaurant. In just 6 months, they spent over $700,000. When questioned, they said they were trying to live the way their parents would have wanted. But to detectives, that sounded too convenient for a story with too much blood. The family's past began to unravel. Jose Menendez, a Cuban immigrant who had risen to become a top executive at Live Entertainment, was admired for his ambition and discipline. But behind closed doors, he ruled with control and intensity. Kitty, once a schoolteacher, had reportedly grown depressed and emotionally unstable in her later years, relying on sleeping pills to get through the day. And then came the breakthrough. In March 1990, Dr. Jerome Oziel, a Beverly Hills psychologist, contacted police. One of his patients, Erik Menendez, had confessed. What Erik revealed would not only name the killers, but expose a hidden world behind the mansion walls, a world only the four of them had ever known. When Erik Menendez's confession became public, It split the nation. Some called it a clear-cut case of cold-blooded murder for money. Others began to wonder, was this actually a desperate cry for help, one that had been ignored for far too long? Erik had gone to Dr. Jerome Ociel seeking therapy. He was anxious, sleep-deprived, haunted by nightmares. And as guilt consumed him, he eventually broke down and said the words that would change everything. "We did it. Lyle and I, we killed them." Unbeknownst to Erik, Dr. Ociel recorded their sessions, fearing for his own safety. In those recordings, Erik described how the brothers had planned the killings for weeks. But he also said something else, something far darker. According to Erik, they weren't motivated by greed, but by fear. He claimed that both he and Lyle had been abused for years by their father, beginning in childhood. It started with control, then escalated into something worse. When Erik finally told his brother, Lyle revealed he too had been victimized. They said that when they tried to confront Jose about the abuse, he responded not with remorse but with threats. He said he would kill us if we ever told anyone, Erik claimed. Their mother, Kitty, either denied the truth or looked the other way. Trapped in what they described as a prison disguised as a home, the brothers said they felt they had nowhere to go and nowhere to hide. In the field of criminal psychology, patricide, the killing of one's parents, is rare. But when it happens, it is often preceded by long-term emotional and physical trauma, especially when the victims are seen not just as parents, but as perpetrators of pain. Erik was the quieter one, withdrawn, fearful, emotionally fragile. Lyle was fiery, protective, the older brother who felt it was his job to fix everything. Psychologists would later testify that Lyle likely drove the plan, while Erik followed out of terror. Yet none of the abuse claims could be fully verified. Jose and Kitty were gone. They couldn't defend themselves. Family and friends were divided. Some described Jose as a stern but loving father. Others said they noticed something broken behind Erik's eyes whenever his father walked into the room. On the stand, Lyle later said, "I didn't kill my parents for money. I killed them because I couldn't survive another day in that house." So, which is it? An act of liberation? Or an unthinkable betrayal disguised as survival? Erik Menendez's confession was a turning point. But there was a complication. Under normal circumstances, therapy sessions are protected by doctor-patient confidentiality. So, how did his recorded confession reach law enforcement? The answer lay with Judalon Smith, Dr. Ociel's girlfriend at the time. After listening to the tapes, she felt what Erik described wasn't just personal trauma, it was a public danger left unaddressed. Believing that silence would make her complicit, she took the recordings to the police. Detectives re-examined the case in light of Erik's words, and soon, the brothers' paper trail unraveled. It turned out that both Lyle and Erik had purchased 2 Mossberg 12-gauge shotguns in San Diego just days before the murders. They had gone to separate stores, used fake IDs, and asked specific questions about ammunition with maximum stopping power. One of the guns was purchased using a credit card that belonged to Lyle's girlfriend, but was used by Erik, an effort to obscure the transaction. This, combined with their knowledge of the house layout and the staging of an alibi, painted a portrait of premeditation, not panic. Still, the defense argued that this wasn't a cold, calculated plan. Instead, it was the desperate reaction of 2 young men spiraling into psychological collapse, terrified their abuse would be exposed and they'd be silenced forever. Evidence offered by the prosecution focused on hard facts: purchase receipts, timeline inconsistencias, surveillance footage from the video store, showing the brothers at a time that didn't match their claims. And most damning of all, the fact that they had gone on a lavish spending spree immediately after the murders. But the defense fought back with equally powerful, though less tangible, evidence. Childhood letters written by Erik that hinted at dark things happening at night. Witnesses, including cousins and former classmates, who testified that Erik would often tremble or shut down when his father touched him. And of course, the therapy tapes themselves, where Erik's voice shook with guilt and fear not pride or malice. In criminal cases, truth doesn't always lie in what's visible, but often in what's suppressed in the pauses, the inconsistencies, the trauma that doesn't show up on x-rays or autopsy reports. As the investigation deepened, The Menendez case transformed from a simple who did it into a deeply layered why did they do it. One side clung to logistics, the other to psychology, but both understood. The truth was messy and impossible to ignore. In July 1993, the courtroom doors opened, and America stepped inside. The trial of Lyle and Erik Menendez began broadcast live, dissected by media, and followed obsessively by a nation that couldn't look away. Two young men stood accused not just of murder, but of killing the very people who gave them life. Prosecutor Pamela Bozanich didn't mince words. From the outset, she framed the case as one of premeditated first-degree homicide, a ruthless plan designed to secure a multi-million-dollar inheritance. She laid out the timeline, the weapons, the purchases, the deceit, the alibi, and the extravagant spending that followed. They weren't victims, she told the jury. They were actors, and the performance ended the moment they got caught. Bozanich dismissed the claims of abuse, arguing that even if true, they didn't justify murder. If you're being abused, you run. You call the police. You seek help. What you don't do is buy 2 shotguns and ambush your parents in the family room. Some jurors nodded. The prosecution's narrative was clean, logical, and unforgiving. But then the defense spoke, and the courtroom changed. Leslie Abramson, Erik's defense attorney, didn't try to hide what had happened. They did it, she said bluntly. But what you need to understand is why. She described a household built on silence and domination, a father who controlled every breath his sons took, and a mother who medicated herself into emotional absence. She played tapes. She presented letters. She called witnesses. And slowly, the courtroom began to hear a second story, one of fear, shame, and collapse. The most devastating moments came not from lawyers, but from the brothers themselves. Erik, barely holding it together, took the stand. I used to think if I said something, someone would help. But then I realized nobody wanted to hear that about a man like my father. Lyle followed, testifying that his mother once walked in on an assault and walked out without a word. He described nights of terror, of whispered threats, and of a final conversation with his father, who allegedly warned, "If you talk, I'll make you disappear." At one point, Lyle broke down and said, "We weren't trying to escape punishment. We just didn't want to die." The trial dragged on for months. 2 juries were selected, one for each brother, but neither could agree on a verdict. After intense deliberation, both panels ended in hung juries, forcing the case into a second trial. But the second trial was different. Held in 1995, it was tightly controlled by the judge. No live broadcasts, limited emotional testimony, tighter restrictions on what the defense could present. Much of the narrative about abuse so central to the first trial was pushed to the margins. In 1996, both Lyle and Erik were found guilty of first-degree murder, with no possibility of parole. When the verdict was read, the brothers showed no visible emotion, no anger, no denial. Just resignation, the kind that comes from knowing that once the courtroom doors close, the world outside will never hear your side again. But would this really be the end of the story? When the verdict came down in 1996, many assumed the case was over. Justice, they said, had been served. But in America, a country where trials often outlive the courtroom, the story of Lyle and Erik Menendez refused to fade. It lingered, not only in public memory, but in cultural consciousness. From the beginning, the case had captivated the nation. Cameras rolled in real time as 2 well-groomed, emotional young men sobbed in court. To some, they looked like spoiled, manipulative killers. To others, they were damaged children, crying out in the only way they had left. The media split along that line. Some newspapers dubbed them Beverly Hills brats. Others questioned what horrors might drive 2 brothers to such extremes. The Cuban-American community, once proud of Jose Menendez's success story, a Cuban immigrant who climbed to the top of the Hollywood executive ladder, struggled with disbelief. Many defended Jose's legacy, dismissing the abuse allegations as character assassination. But as time passed, public sentiment began to shift, especially as the Me Too movement reshaped the conversation around abuse, trauma, and silence. Suddenly, The Menendez brothers' claims didn't seem so far-fetched. Thousands of survivors began sharing their own stories, many of which mirrored the same patterns. A charismatic, respected abuser, a disbelieved victim, and a household bound by fear. On TikTok, YouTube, and true crime podcasts, a new generation rediscovered the case. They weren't influenced by tabloid headlines from the 90s. They listened to raw court audio, watched unedited testimony, and heard Erik's trembling voice for themselves. Many asked, did we fail to listen? Were we too quick to judge? New witnesses, once silent, stepped forward. Some confirmed they had seen Jose behave in disturbing ways with his sons. Others, who had once doubted, now expressed uncertainty. In 2023, attorneys representing the Menendez brothers filed a petition for re-examination, citing new evidence and previously unheard testimonies. While courts have yet to formally reopen the case, the filing alone reignited debate. Through it all, Lyle and Erik have remained in separate prisons, denied parole, denied retrials, but not denied public interest. They've married via correspondence. Lyle has earned a college degree. Erik teaches yoga and mentors younger inmates. Thousands of strangers write to them not out of pity, but out of recognition. Recognition of something that resonates not with the crime, but with the feeling of being unheard. And so the question persists. Was justice truly served? Or was justice only possible within the narrow bounds of evidence, while the deeper truth, the unprovable, invisible, emotional truth, was left outside the courtroom? Inside separate prison cells in California, the Menendez brothers now live in middle age, far from the glossy streets of Beverly Hills, far from tennis courts, Rolex watches, and the mansion where their story began. Lyle's hair has turned gray. Erik, once anxious and expressive, has grown quieter with the years. But perhaps, in the stillness of prison, they've found a kind of peace, not because they escaped punishment, but because they finally escaped the house that once imprisoned them long before the law did. Outside, though, the case continues to live on. Law schools teach it as a classic example of how law, trauma, and media collide. True crime forums dissect it. Documentaries reframe it. Social media humanizes it. But the core question remains, can someone be guilty of murder and still be a victim? Justice, we like to believe, is blind, but the Menendez case suggests otherwise. It reveals how the system tends to favor what can be proven: bruises, receipts, blood spatter over what can only be described. Fear, memory, silence. No one disputes that Jose and Kitty Menendez met a tragic, violent end. But their deaths uncovered something deeper, the silence that often lives beneath perfection. A silence that doesn't show up on crime scene reports, but lingers in the minds of children forced to grow up under its weight. We can argue, we can mourn, we can condemn. But in the end, what remains is not certainty. It's the echo of a question no court has fully answered. Was justice done? Or did the legal system punish what it could measure and ignore what it could not understand? You've been watching Echoes of the Court, where trials don't end at the verdict, and justice, when it speaks, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just an echo.